All right, good morning. My name is John Stotts. I'm the Director of Adult Faith Formation at Christ the King Catholic Church here in Nashville. Last June, after the murder of George Floyd by 4 Minneapolis police officers, a number of parishioners gathered on Zoom for a series of 4 weekly sessions to discuss what happened, what has been happening, and what it means for our parish community, for the church. One of the major outcomes of these reflection sessions was a creation of something that we're calling the Anti-Racism Ministry of Christ the King, which is really just a framework for parishioners themselves to create and participate in various grassroots efforts that focus on promoting racial justice issues, primarily within our own parish, but gradually as we change the culture here to participate in ventures in the wider Nashville community. We'll have a town hall meeting at the end of this series for anyone who's interested to hear more, who wants to get involved, or who wants to come back and report on what you've been doing. One of these projects has been designed to create opportunities for our community to better understand the history of white supremacy, racism, Black history, and our various roles in the creation and maintenance of these systems. And here I'm gonna begin with a quote from James Baldwin, writing to his nephew, speaking of white people. Baldwin writes, and I quote, "They are in effect still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. They have had to believe for many years, and for innumerable reasons, that Black men are inferior to white men. Many of them, indeed, know better, but as you will discover, people find it very difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. In this case, the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shining and all the stars aflame. You would be frightened because it is out of the order of nature. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it so profoundly attacks one's sense of one's own reality. Well, the Black man has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, as an immovable pillar, and as he moves out of his place, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundations." Here, to hopefully shake many of us to our foundations, is Dr. Learotha Williams. He's taught African American history at Armstrong State University. He taught past tense from 2004 to 2009. He's now professor of African American and public history at Tennessee State University. His research interests is the history of African American slaves in Nashville prior to the American Civil War, including the slave auctions that were held on our own Charlotte Avenue. And in 2018, he spearheaded the installation of the historical marker you can find on the corner of 4th and Charlotte, again, dedicated in 2018. He also researches the history of North Nashville, predominantly Black neighborhood, as part of the North Nashville Heritage Project. He's interviewed residents and businesses owners on its main thoroughfare, Jefferson Street, and he's here to share from his research and wisdom. The title of today's presentation is "I Am Black But Comely, an exploration of Black Nashville from the territorial period to the end of Reconstruction." He'll offer a follow-up presentation this Thursday at 7 p.m. You can use the same link to access that presentation. So we're not going to unmute ourselves, but without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Williams. Thanks for being here, Dr. Williams.
Thank you all for the invitation to speak to you this morning. I'm always a bit honored when folks check in to hear what I have to say on the weekends, because I know there are other things you could be doing. So I'll try to make this interesting and informative. And I will pull up and a little bit early and take any questions that you may have. I'll answer questions until y'all don't have any more questions. Okay, so let's get started. I'm gonna hold my breath for a moment while I try to share my screen with you. Okay. I struggled with figuring out a name for this, and that first let me say this: my the way I try to look at Nashville history, particularly the history of African Americans in the space, is I try to look at it from the eyes of African Americans. So my vantage point is always, well, what did the enslaved person think during the antebellum period about the space? Or what did the free Black person think about the space? And this is how I go forward with it. And one of the things that is really important to me, particularly in my work at TSU, is that a focus on memory. That is what we remember, but by that same token, I look at our amnesia, both individual and collective. So, with this title, what I was trying to do is to place an emphasis on the beauty of the Black experience in this city, although it is oftentimes not highlighted. And that can be because we don't know, but I referenced amnesia a second ago. Sometimes our amnesia is selective. So let's go through and take a look at these slides for a few minutes. Bear with me. I think one of the most important and symbolic spaces in the city is our public square park. And it's a really fine space, right? I oftentimes joke with my students that, if I was a student and there was a young lady who caught my eye, then I would take her to the public square and we would set out a few sandwiches because it's nice and serene. It's a good space. Um, but the square has a very, very dark history. So much so that when
Wait,
you
we're gonna
learn,
learn about Black history in Nashville.
so much so that
Pops
when
is watching
you
this.
learn the history of it, it can interfere with your good times. I remember going to an En Vogue concert there. It was really, and I loved that group. Then I thought about the sound that was coming through there on that Saturday when I was there, and then I just posed that against what it might have been like on a Saturday afternoon during the antebellum period. Um, Let me explain something to you. Every single Saturday during the antebellum period, somebody was bought or sold in that space, either on the steps or the courthouse, or if not there, along the lines of some of the many, many brokerage firms that line that space from the public square down Charlotte right to about 4th Avenue. Every single Saturday without fail until the Federals show up in 1862 and that comes to a stop. Then there's a bank that's set on the northwest corner that would offer loans at a very generous rate for people who wanted to purchase enslaved people. And then every single store that lined that space made some profit off the buying and selling of human beings. And then you had an insurance company, Aetna, also sat in that northwest corner. And they would offer insurance policies on enslaved people. That is, if I had purchased something and I kind of figured that they were going to be involved in some sort of hazardous job, I could get an insurance policy on them. So as we look around this space and we think about the buying and selling and exchange of goods that took place here, and you look at all those businesses, you quickly conclude that slavery was big business in Nashville. And I probably could make a decent argument later on if y'all invite me back, right? That it was probably Nashville's first big business. Um, but we don't really have much of a record of how that impacted the enslaved. And we'll probe a little bit today, and you can, with your own background, with your own experiences, um, almost come to some sort of conclusion as to how they would have felt. So I encourage you all to put yourselves in the minds of these people as we make our way through this talk this morning. One thing that we do have at our disposal are some the slave narratives that were recorded during the Great Depression. And with these, they give some insight into the experience, but some of them are kind of, we look at them with a raised eyebrow because they are taken during Jim Crow, and you have maybe a formerly enslaved person who, if they're talking to them in the 1930s, then that meant that they must have been, 70, 80 some odd years old. And we realize that none of our memories get better as time progresses, right? But we do have some things that give insight into what life must have been like. So, for example, this is an enslaved woman who lived in Nashville, but she talked about living in Gallatin prior to her moving here. Now, I'll read this very quickly. She says, well, they brought her from old Virginia to Tennessee when she was but a child. They settled in Gallatin. It is a big, flourishing town now. While she was there, they came another family named Alaskis, and this was Grandpa's family. Now, Grandma's folks was named Perry. You see, Grandma was their house girl, and Grandpap was Alaska's houseboy. They kept her because she was young and supple and could have lots of children. Ain't that hard? She waited on the missus and did the little nice things about the house, You see, the object was to raise her and to sell her so that she would make a lot of money for them. Now, for me, that one statement is a statement that is oftentimes glossed over or overlooked when we think about slavery in whatever spaces we are looking at or visiting, for example. Because you can visit a lot of these plantations out here around town, and I'm saying this, but my friends, let me preface all of this by saying this. I'm friends with everybody that works out there, right? But historically, you don't get the most basic understanding of slavery, and that is these people were human beings, but they were treated as commodities, as property, as goods that were to be bought and sold. And we're mindful that, whoever purchased that person controlled them from that moment until they died, really after they died, because the bodies could be sold to a hospital or a medical school as cadavers to be used by the students. So when we look at this, when we try to get a glimpse of what went on, not only around the South, but in Nashville, be mindful that when somebody purchased a girl or young girl, maybe a 7-year-old girl, he's not just purchasing that one girl, he's purchasing all of the children that she may give birth to. So if she can give birth to 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 kids, which is not out of the realm of the possibility during this time, then that's quite a bit of profit he can gain from just that one investment in that year. But as we look at Nashville, I want y'all to understand this, that African Americans or enslaved Blacks were with Robertson and Donaldson from day one. But when we look at them in the historical record, they almost exist as phantoms, as shadows, even the ones that we can identify. We really don't know a whole lot about them. These are some of the names that that we know of for sure, but you're mindful as you look at these names on the screen here. You only see first names, right? And oftentimes it's our second name, our last name, our surnames that gives us our identity. So we kind of know these folks, but we don't know them. We know about Robert, who belonged to James Robertson, who was recorded to have died during a Native American struggle. And there are two unknown men who are referenced around Fort Nashville who were assigned to guard the corn supply against roaming herds of buffalo. Then we know of Moses Renfro, and he's one of the guys that we actually celebrate in the public square. If you go to the public square, there's a marker for him. But the rest of them, you got Adam, Dave, Fib, Phoebe, Cumbo, George, Patsy, and Jack Civil. We really don't know what it was like for them. And even though we go through the record and we can see kind of what Robertson and his settlers felt, what they thought, because that it's recorded, we have to get kind of creative to put ourselves in the place of the enslaved that come here. In order to even talk about this, I had to branch out beyond history. I have a friend who's retired from the forestry service that I was able to collar. I think we were down there in Corinth, Mississippi, and walking through the woods, and I asked him what Nashville would have looked like during the 1790s, and he discussed hickories, he discussed hawthorns, he discussed seeing river cane, and this is an example of the river cane that's at Fort Nashville today. He discussed pine trees, and I didn't think there was a pine tree within 100 miles of here. And he said they're tough to find because they used them in all those doggone furnaces over toward Charlotte. Then I thought about that, and then I thought about these people who would have been arriving with the founders, and thinking about where they came from, right? Because most of them came from Virginia and North Carolina. And we're bearing in mind that Virginia was established, Jamestown was established in 1607. So it's 1779 when people first start showing up here. I realized that these people were coming from very mature slave societies into an area that had not experienced that sort of agricultural growth. Now we're mindful of this, that I'm from Florida, and I'm pretty sure that they taught y'all something similar here in Tennessee. Where any of you guys taught that the forest was so thick in Tennessee, a squirrel could climb a tree in North Carolina and run clear to Arkansas without touching the ground? Okay, I know that's hilarious, but we subscribe to that. But I spoke to the guy who actually studied the geography of Tennessee, and he reminded me that there were a lot of plains in the state. But nevertheless, said all that to say this. This was still an area that had to be developed. So they would have had to clear land. They would have had to knock down a few trees. So the type of slavery that they would have experienced here would have been pretty similar to what the first settlers in Jamestown or in the Carolinas would have experienced. So it's much, much more difficult than what they left behind. And another thing to focus on with all those names that I gave you, notice I didn't mention any of their families, right? So that meant that they left people behind. So all of those names that we saw on the screen, and I heard Deacon Hill talking about a funeral that he oversaw yesterday. Um, in many ways, these were their arrival here was tantamount to a physical death because they would not ever see those folks that they left behind again. One of the more interesting figures from this period is Jack Silva. There's some debate as to whether or not he was free or enslaved when he arrived here, but we do know that he was an integral part of the Fort Nashboro community. And he did like he was supposed to do, right? He worked, he became a valuable part of the society, and he was very much expecting um, James Robertson to give him a land grant once once things were settled and they started issuing out land grants. He expected one, but lo and behold, his name was omitted. According to the record, he was able to get a parcel of land for himself, but somehow the document got washed away during a torrential downpour. And I'm still not clear precisely what happened, but he didn't get his land warrant. Now, I'm saying that to set up the next thing I want to talk about, and that being the fact that on one occasion, Jack Silva travels with a flotilla down to present day Donaldson. This is a photograph of the Stones River. I really like walking the Greenway there when I have a spare moment. But as they go to Donaldson to collect corn, they load up the barges and then they are attacked by a group of Cherokee. And the Cherokee massacre the entire group, with the exception of Civil and three others. Civil is able to survive the attack and he's taken prisoner. And the Cherokee take him down toward near Chattanooga. And a curious thing happens in that it appears that Civil goes from being a prisoner of war to actually joining the community. So much so it began to be whispered around Nashville that, hey, Jack Civil is attacking settlers in Middle Tennessee. And he, according to the story, he sets up a camp that becomes known as Jack's place. Now, I can remember moving here from Savannah, Georgia, and getting outside of Chattanooga. And, I'm driving along and I see the sign that says Jack Lake and Reservoir. And I'm like, that's an interesting name. It doesn't look quite right, but let me check it out. So I go and I look and I remember snapping this picture saying I was going to check it out. And then lo and behold, Nickeljack actually is a Native American word for running water. I say, okay. So, but then I went back and looked at, I think it might have been Robertson's account of the territorial period. And I found this passage, and this may have been what the historian at the time was interpreting, but he saw the same thing I saw when I saw the sign. Jack Civil gained some notoriety, so much so that settlers here in Nashville go down to his camp to destroy it, and they demolish it. But ultimately, he comes back to Nashville and he explains to the people here that he never ever pulled his gun on a white settler here in Middle Tennessee. Few people believe him, but they accept him back into the society and he marries a Native American woman. Now, I bring this up because it's an incredible story, but it's one of the things that reveals, I think, some of the work that we still need to do on telling the story of Nashville and the African American experience, and that is we need to pay a little bit closer attention to their relationships with Native Americans, because some fought right alongside the settlers, but then you have others that join Native American groups and become incorporated into their society. So this is an element of the history that needs to be probed a bit further. But as we progress, there are three things that occur that allows Nashville to economically gain a solid foothold in the state. There are three things that pretty much guarantee that it wouldn't just be a territorial settlement that would up and disappear. These three things were the Haitian Revolution, 1791, then um, Eli Whitney patenting the cotton gin, and then the continuous influx of people from Virginia and North Carolina to the area after the American Revolution. Because with this, with the patent of the cotton gin, which enabled cotton production to become wildly, wildly profitable, just opposed against the Louisiana Purchase, which later occurs, which essentially provides an empire for slavery. Now Nashville can really prosper because of its proximity to a major river and the desire to settle those areas that were that were acquired as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. Now Nashville takes off as a slave port, so much so that it becomes the second most profitable slave port, the second largest slave port in the volunteer state. The only place that could surpass it was Memphis. So it's at this point when we begin to see some of the larger Davidson County plantations emerge. And I'm saying all of that, but I want you to be mindful of this. There were only, during the early period, there were only like 3 really large plantations or planters during this period. You had Overton, and then you got folks at Belmead, and then you got Andrew Jackson. But then later on, of course, you'll have the Ackland money that establishes that establishes her as the wealthiest woman in America. But be mindful that that money was based largely upon the slave trade. With all of this, and bearing in mind that African Americans made up about 20% of the population, both enslaved and free here in Davidson County, and bearing in mind that they are a valuable part of our society, the question becomes, where are they represented, at least in our public spaces or in our public memories? We have a few monuments, well, a couple of monuments, such as Jeffrey Locklear, who was a free man of color, who belonged to Andrew Jackson. We find him being celebrated as a loyal slave, and then later as a free Black person. But when we start considering that slavery would not have existed a single day without violence, had whites not had the gun, the whip, the club, the ability to imposed unchecked violence on these folks, that they wouldn't have picked a bushel, a bag of cotton, or a hogshead of tobacco. All of this was extracted from them by force. So I oftentimes wonder um, where are the people represented who don't fall into that category? And if violence was key in maintaining the system, why don't we ever hear about it? I know when we go to Hermitage, right? You go to Hermitage and it talks about Jackson's most faithful slave, the slave that was buried on site with him, and I understand that, but I do know that Jackson has a very bad reputation when it comes to Native Americans, and I'm pretty sure that that sort of violent attitude is not something that you can just turn on and off, particularly when you're dealing with people that you have complete control over. So we must probe a little bit further if we can to try to get a true nature of what things were like for African Americans at those spaces and in the city. Um, the city itself purchased African Americans to do the sorts of things that we expect city workers to do, right? This is um, a well, it's a slide that I got from the Tennessee State Archives that discusses the enslaved people that were purchased by Davidson County during the 1830s. And it's interesting because we get their names and we're mindful that they're the first names. But I think what is most interesting out of all of this, even before we get beyond over here where it talks about the price, are the physical appearances of the people that are listed. If you look at the physical descriptions, and we don't have time to go through these in detail, but you see that every single one of these people that are listed they're listed with having a either scar on their face, burns, um, missing teeth. One of these guys, if you get down here to where it says Charles and Lucinda, you get down there, you'll see that it says all of the toes on his right feet have been injured by being frostbitten. So when we see this, and if you go further and look at the slave advertisement, and we see the physical descriptions, you reach the conclusion that, gosh, um, what I'm reading here doesn't really line up with a lot of the stories that I'm being told about slavery out there at Hermitage or at Travelers Rest or even here in town. In regards to Jackson, I want to take a quick moment to read this one to you. This was an enslaved person that ran away from the Hermitage. This is an ad Jackson placed in the newspaper. It says $50 reward. Eloped from the subscriber, living near Nashville on the 25th of June last. A mulatto man slave, about 30 years old, 6 feet and an inch high, stout made and active. Talks sensible, stoops in his walk, and has a remarkable large foot broad across the root of the toes. Will pass for a free man, as I am informed that he has obtained by some means certificates as such. Took with him a drab green coat, dark mixed body coat, and ruffled shirt, cotton homespun shirts and overalls. He will make for Detroit, through the states of Kentucky and Ohio, or for the upper part of Louisiana. Okay, this is the part I really want you to pay attention to. He says, the above reward will be given any person that will take him and deliver him to me or secure him in jail so that I can get him. If taken out of the state, the above reward and all reasonable expenses paid, and $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him to the amount of 300. Andrew Jackson, near Nashville State, Tennessee. So the last part of the paragraph suggests that Jackson wasn't really particular about catching this man, because he actually offers incentive for the slave catchers to beat him, saying that he'll pay him $10 extra for every 100 lashes, up to 300. So knowing that, and thinking that, hey, this is consistent with what we have learned of Jackson in Florida, have learned about him in his relations with Native Americans. It's hard to imagine that that kind of violence didn't make its way out to the Hermitage. But not all African Americans who were living in this area were enslaved as we would ordinarily define it. There were some that were hired out, or Dr. Lovett in his book calls them nominal slaves. A hired out slave was typically an enslaved person with a skill. And what they would do is they would go out and work, earn wages, and then give the wages to their masters. Sometimes their masters would allow them to keep some of the wages, which provided an interesting opportunity, right? Because if I'm frugal, if I save up my money, then perhaps I can buy my freedom or buy my child's freedom. This story I'm going to share with you now, it's one of my favorite stories about Nashville, and that it's complicated, but it reveals, I think, the ways in which African Americans try to negotiate their experience. This involves a lady named Sally Thomas. Sally Thomas was enslaved in Virginia. According to the record, she was an enslaved person of mixed ancestry. We believe that her father was actually her master, which is interesting, which means that if he sold her, then he sold his own daughter. She arrives in Nashville with a new master and with two boys in tow. And a curious thing happens. She asks her master if she can hire out some of her time, and he agrees. So she's able to rent out a space near you all know where the Doubletree Hotel is downtown? I think that's the Mondrian. No, it's Dietrich. Right at that corner. She sets up, she rents out a space and she starts washing clothes. And it's an interesting story because she never spends any of her money. She saves all of her money with the intent that she's going to save up enough money to buy her boys freedom. She manages to hook one of her sons up with a lawyer who really takes a liking to him. So he essentially hires himself out as a manservant to this attorney. Well, she washes clothes, and in my mind, I can see her carrying clothes maybe down to the Cumberland and washing shirts, and starting to think that every shirt that she washed, every pair of pants or dress that she washed, she imagined them not being an article of clothing, but a link in the chains that held her son to slavery. She saw that as a link that she was breaking. So the attorney that hired out one of her sons likes him so much that upon his death, he leaves some money in his will to purchase his freedom. The thing is, Sally ends up getting pregnant again, and this time it was from a judge here in Nashville. One of the things my students and I grapple with in class is whether or not this relationship was consensual. Could it be consensual? Because I'm certain that if she was washing clothes to feed her two sons, she would not, under any other circumstances, have another baby. So one of her sons actually runs away, and he successfully finds his freedom. But then her youngest son, this is the one I think that is most interesting in all of this conversation, and that she works and works and works, and she gets really close to having enough money to purchase this freedom, but she's a few dollars short, so she asks an attorney, will he front her the money, and he agrees. And she gets sick and she dies before her son is able to complete the process to obtain his freedom. But this particular son, James Thomas, whom she had already made arrangements to receive some education in Nashville, and I'll talk a little bit about Nashville education in our next conversation. But James Thomas goes north, and he becomes one of the most wealthiest African Americans, most successful African Americans in the town that he settled. So I reference Sally Thomas as a nominal slave because she was a slave, but she occupied a curious space where she was almost free. And then you have your free blacks. And the one that I want to focus on, and this is one of my favorites, is Sarah Estelle. Sarah Estelle sold ice cream. It was a custard-based ice cream, and she sold it about a block away from where the public library is on Church Street. Her clientele was both black and white. And according to the story, her ice cream and her other goodies that she made in her shop made her one of the most well-liked and well-respected free persons in Nashville. But even though you are free in Nashville, there are some limitations. There was a slave patrol that ran in Nashville that if you were between the ages, and initially when it started during the 1830s, you'd have to be between the ages of like 15 and 55. But it would be something that would be required of the adult males, the same way that we would have jury duty, right? You'd be required to serve on the slave patrol from sundown to sunrise in the town. And during this period, you'd be given great authority to police both the enslaved and free black population. That is, you have the authority to enter any slave premises or any black person's premises to search it for runaways. You'd have permission to accost any black person that you saw on the streets after dark. So tremendous authority to them. And in some instances, toward the 1840s, 1850s, Nashville actually becomes a sundown town. That is, if you were black and on the streets after sundown, you could face arrest or a serious fine. Then by the time you get to the 1840s, 1850s, the state legislature passed a law that said if a slave master was going to free any of their enslaved population, they would free them, but they would have to send them out of the state. Then by the 1850s, they would have to send them to Africa, send them to Liberia. And the whole idea of colonization had resonated in the Black community as early as the American Revolutionary period. But it was cost prohibitive. It was so expensive. So you find very few people that actually go through with this. One notable exception, and this is a name that might ring out to some of you, Montgomery Bell sent a few of his enslaved population to Liberia. And there was another attorney in Franklin whose name escapes my mind, a judge rather. He sent some of his folks to Liberia. But that's it. So I said all that to say this: it was difficult. It was difficult to be free and Black in Nashville. But it's slavery in this city was resisted because I talked about early on how Nashville was a gateway, if you will, to the Deep South. By the same token, it also became a gateway to freedom. An enslaved person here who could stow away on a boat, and if he's fortunate, the boat would make their way to the Harpeth, it would go further north, and then within a few days, they would arrive at the Ohio River. If they could successfully get on the other side of the Ohio River, they are free. But we have some instances of escape that reveals a dark side to the institution. For example, in this slide that I have on the screen here, a young girl's mother had run away, and her master threatened her with punishment if she did not give up where her mother had went, and this young woman committed suicide. And I think I may have one more that deals with this. Same sort of thing here, where a boat is docked on the Cumberland, and a runaway slave is caught, but rather than be taken back into slavery, he jumps overboard and commits suicide. A famous Black poet once said that it was Miri Baraka who said that there's a railroad at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean that's made of human bones. And I thought of that poem when I considered slavery along the Cumberland, about how many enslaved people actually freed themselves by jumping in the river. The end of slavery comes to Nashville for all intents and purposes in 1862. This is a sketch from Harper's magazine that shows when the Union soldiers arrived at the public square. For many soldiers, this was a nightmare. For many Southerners, this was a nightmare. Nashville has fallen to the hated Yankees, and the South would never regain it during the war. But for a Black person that's seeing this, they are thinking that, hey, this is what freedom looks like. But it was a curious, somewhat interesting view of freedom. Some of them might have gotten disillusioned because these same soldiers that come into town that are supposed to be liberators, roughly around March, April, May of, no, excuse me, April and May of 62, these soldiers are going around to Black churches, to places where Black people congregate, and they are compelling them to work on the defenses of Nashville. Some of them are compelled to work at, and this is one of my favorite places in the city, they are compelled to work at Fort Negli. Um, Fort Negli has been recently designated as a UNESCO site of memory, and this is arguably one of the most important spaces in this city, at least in my mind, because for them, this site represented freedom. I can imagine these people that are working in these camps who ultimately are housed in contraband camps, camps that are set up by the Union soldiers to accommodate them and to accommodate other freedom-seeking blacks that make their way to Nashville. They come there and they stay in these camps, and for them, they build the forts that encircle the city. But for them, these sites become monuments to freedom. That is, this although we don't have many legacies of the effort for freedom here in Nashville, um, the effort by blacks to obtain freedom here in Nashville, I think Fort Negli is one. But and this was a first taste of freedom, but it was a heck of a first taste, because some of them actually came here and they got sick and they died. But one thing I want to make sure each of you understand is that they didn't come here empty-handed. They brought their culture with them. So their notions of freedom, their music, their food, just the way that they experience life as enslaved people, their hopes and desires for the future. They brought this with them. And all of these things contributed to making Nashville what it is today. We would not be the music city without their music, the music that they raised out of the cotton and the tobacco fields and the cornfield while they were laboring. And notions of free compulsory education. This is something that resonates in their mind. And certainly we would not be the Athens of the South without them pushing for education. I'm going to pull up here because I see I'm up against the clock. So what I'll do next time is, if I can, John, I'll pick up with Reconstruction and we'll run through the end of civil rights. Thank you all for listening this morning. And I'll take any questions if there are any.
Thanks very much, Dr. Williams. Again, feel free to chime in with your questions or throw them up in the chat, and I'll read them.
I have a quick question. The impeccable lecture, Dr. Williams, appreciate it very much. You had made a comparison that with Nashville to Jamestown and the Carolinas. Are there a lot, in your experience in doing this work in preservation and finding this information, would you say that it was more difficult for that in the area of Nashville than the Carolinas and Jamestown because of where it was located, and do you find it harder trying to figure out more of the artifacts? Is it as preserved? Because where I'm from, it's very, 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 very well preserved, and we've been able to fix revisionist problems, people saying it wasn't as bad as it really was. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
And here's the thing. For me, Jamestown would have been worse because they really didn't know what they were doing, if that makes any sense. Jamestown I can remember taking first early American course in history, and we talked about how they settled in marshy plains. They didn't do the most basic things that were necessary to survive. Robertson and Donaldson and others who made their way here, they had that experience to draw upon, right? They knew what would work and they knew what wouldn't work. So I don't see them as making the same sort of mistakes. But in looking at the space through the eyes of African Americans, it's difficult because they they're leaving folks behind that they would never see again. Same as the folks in Jamestown, but by that token, the the world that they were entering wouldn't have been as foreign to them. If that makes any sense. Because on the one hand, you got Africans coming over, but now you have sort of Creole version of enslaved people, Black people that were born here. Um, as far as artifacts, it's difficult because I don't know. Oftentimes, the spaces have been completely erased from our collective memory. We go to a plantation and you see maybe one or two slave cabins, but you're like, hey, this guy owned 150 some odd people. So where are their living quarters? Just even the most basic stuff like plates and material culture, we don't really see that as well. As far as farming, and and I'm sorry if I'm beating your question to death. But as far as farming, we got to understand that a lot of this area would have been plains as well. You think Great Plains, you tend to think of, like out west. I spoke to a geographer who showed me that a lot of the grassy areas that we see between here and maybe Clarksville is plains. So I don't know, but still, there would have been a heck of a lot of trees that needed to be knocked down. There would have been a lot of stuff that needed to be done to make this area available. Okay, and I apologize for going at that too, but it was a really good question. Thank you for that.
Oh, it's really impressive. It's really amazing. Your insight is impeccable. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I think also it's a complicated portion of history where I think definitely not as much access to education and the ability to read and things like that. And also just the idea of that people are property. I can't wrap my head around it because, I'm in a different type of generation. But just, would there have been a reason to write down certain things? Would certain people who have the access to write history books and things like that had the notion to write anything about civilization that was considered property? Or like, if they can't read it, why should we write it down? That's just, it's kind of, it hurts. It hurts. I think a lot of really rich, wonderful things have been lost, but also so much added. Like you said, with music, I have a music degree, so it's very, very important to me. So this is just absolutely close to my heart. All very, distinguished and, honored music, Western music comes, from blues, which blues is absolutely derived from slavery. So I just hold on to that, you know, I hold on to that contribution, and the songs really did tell the story, and we kind of have to grab as much as we can.
And you make some really good points. Here's a really clumsy example I use, but it's one that y'all can relate to, I'm sure. You know how we celebrate Thanksgiving, and our friends and loved ones come to our house. I'm gonna tell you how it is in my house. It might not apply to you guys, but when folks can come to my house and they'll be here for maybe 4 days. And then after they leave, when I walk around my house, I can tell that somebody has been there, right? Because their fingerprints are all over the place. Refrigerator's gonna be empty. Car's probably not gonna have any gas in it. All of the good libations that I have in my cabinet are going to be empty. All right, but they're only there. The point I'm trying to make is they're only there for 4 days, and I can see that. How is it possible for a person to enslave 50, 60, 70 some odd people for 2, 3 generations, and for you to visit that space and not to see their fingerprints all over it? So I encourage you all to, when you go to a space that may have had enslaved people living there, and you look at the magnificent homes and the nice masonry, chances are it's probably a black brick mason who did that, or the carpentry work on that barn. You look and it's like, wow, that's a mighty fine barn. It's been standing up for 200 and some odd years. Like, okay, chances are there was some black carpenters involved in that. So the monuments are all around us, but I don't know if we, you have to train ourselves to look at stuff differently. Okay. Thank you for your question and observation. Thank you.
Dr. Williams, could you talk a little bit about, you talk about the business of slavery.
Yes.
You talk about banks that were created for loans and insurance companies. Could you talk about how important that business of slavery was to the American experiment?
Okay.
It's a big one, right?
This will put it into some context for you. By the 1840s, cotton production represented about 54% of all U.S. exports. And you think about what that means in English, that means that more than every other ship that left here going to a foreign port was loaded down with cotton. Okay. The cotton was picked in the South, but most of those banks were in the North. The manufacturing was in the North. The shipbuilding industry was in New England. So oftentimes when we think of slavery, we rake Southerners over the coals because because that's the most visible part of it, right? We see these people that are laboring and we see them being punished, and we see them running away by the droves, but economically we don't really focus on the money aspect of it. That is those banks that are making the loans for the land and the slaves. Those banks that are funding it. I talked about I talked about the public square as being a place where you could go and buy clothing for the enslaved people. Most of those clothes were made in northern manufacturers. So when we look at it in terms of its economic impact or importance to this country, we're mindful that there's tremendous money made by Southern planters, but by the same token, a lot of Northerners made money off the institution as well. Um, and I think the most visible part of it during this period was, the Aetna insurance company that I referenced. They were based in New York City. Okay. Thank you for your question.
Let me pause briefly to let anyone who needs to get off here to do so, and we'll take some more questions. Thanks again, Dr. Williams.
Yeah,
Oh, and just a reminder, 7 p.m. Thursday night, come back and hear the rest of the story.
I'll start with Reconstruction on Thursday night.
Dr. Williams,
Yeah.
I was thinking as you were talking about the need to remember and how there's so much amnesia in our culture. A couple years ago, I went to see the new Tennessee State Museum and to see its history of Tennessee. And while you were speaking, I was trying to remember how much of the African American real experience I saw in what is a pretty fantastic depiction of Tennessee history. And to be honest with you, I can't remember much of anything. Have you visited the museum? Your thoughts about how it remembers for us?
Let me put a disclaimer out there first. I'm really good friends with several people at the museum, and as their friend, I oftentimes speak to them pretty candidly. This was one of the issues I saw with the museum when it first opened up, in that the story that they told of slavery, which was actually pretty good, it was segregated in this one space, and you had to go looking for it. You had to go, Jim. You had to go looking for it. I took my public history class there, right? Because one of the things we do is we critique museums, and there were about 15 of us, and we missed it until we saw it, if that makes any sense. And I think one of the issues is that although they do a good job, it's not integrated into Tennessee history as it should be. Because I really think that as soon as you walk in and you start talking about Native Americans, then there should be some reference to the interaction between Native Americans, African Americans, and the white settlers that come there, because you got three cultures that intersect into this space that I think makes a really good story. But if you remove one, you're only getting a part of the story. Blacks in the Civil War, I didn't talk a whole lot about it today, but I will talk about the U.S. colored troops next time we talk. I saw some reference to them, but not a whole lot. But then here's a homework assignment for everybody. Well, you can't go to the museum now, but next time you go, count the number of muskets and Civil War cannons in there and see what you come up with. Some things are overrepresented. And I understand that Tennessee was the second largest theater during the war, but surely we can be defined by more than just 4 years. We had more than 4 good years of history, I think. But they struggle, and this will be my last point I make on this. There are not a whole lot of African Americans in the museum field. I'm friends with most of them in this area, except they might have some coming through the pike right now who's just started down at MTSU that I don't know. But the ones that are professionals in the field, I know them. And if they're really good, everybody wants them. It's a field where they are are, and like most people, are woefully underpaid. But if they can find a good gig, they'll leave Tennessee, and I don't know if I can blame them for that. But all that is to say, my friends at the museum, they are doing good work, but there's still some room for growth. Thanks. Other questions?
Hello, Dr. Williams.
Good morning.
If somebody who's on this and they're trying to figure out whether they start, if they want to kind of revamp or I guess retrain their own mind in this particular area, the first thing I recommend is genealogy, to go back in their own family's history. What do you recommend?
I think all history starts at home. My foray in the history was simply listening to my uncles tell stories. A lot of times I would listen and then later on try to verify them, but it fed into my understanding of who I was and my identity, my role and where I fit in the space that we call, in this place we call life. Genealogy is a good place because it's personal. Progressing from there, I think, and Rodney, you're gonna laugh because you've taken my class. You know I'm always talking about food, right? An examination of what you eat and why is a good road to travel down. If I ever get a chance to retire, I want to write a book on Southern recipes, maybe focused on Middle Tennessee, just to celebrate that and to give some insight into history. Another, just a quick story while I'm thinking about it. I'm originally from Tallahassee, Florida, but I got deep South Georgia roots. And one of our staples is grits. No, we don't put sugar in our grits down there, no. But I remember my first job being in Savannah, so I went and visited a Gullah community, and was talking to this guy, and he casually walked me over to a grinder. He had an ear of corn, and he dropped the ear of corn and ground it up. And then as I looked at it, he opened it up and he had two mesh sheets in it, right? One mesh caught the coarse stuff, and then the other caught the finer stuff. And he said, "Look here, that top stuff, that's grits, and the bottom stuff is cornmeal." And it was like he had just translated the Rosetta Stone to me. Just that process of watching him do that, because it was something really simple. But I do realize now how filling grits were for us coming up, right? This is something that we ate every single day without fail. And we take grits in my family really serious, to the point where we actually, when we get together, we have contests to see who makes the best pot of grits. And by the way, y'all looking at the champ, right? But all of that is to say that whole thing about grits being a staple of our diet led me to a greater understanding of my history, because I realized what we ate and why we ate it, because it had something quick that needed to be done that you could put in your belly and you could work all day and not be hungry. So, Mr. Donaldson, to answer your question, genealogy, yes, would be a start, but I think to you just find what you are passionate about and use that as a lens to view the past. Okay. Ms. Boyd, you have
Yes, I just have a question. I'm curious about where the place was where you showed the stone with the picture of Jeffrey, or the information about Jeffrey Lockefeller was. It looked like there was a whole series, and I just wondered where is that place?
that's at the public square.
Oh, okay. I guess I haven't
Yeah.
been there in a while.
Yeah, it's just they're still there because I went there when they put up the when they did the COVID memorial.
Uh-huh.
They're still there, so it's along the southern part of the public square. There are a bunch of them.
Okay. Thank you. I'll go there.
You might say that Tennessee State students launched a civil rights movement in that they were the first place to desegregate the lunch counters, and it spread. But between 1862 and the early not 60s, was there freedom for blacks at all, or did Jim Crow rule the whole area, or was Nashville freed from that?
You have a civil rights movement in this state from its earliest days because they were always pushing for freedom in some form. You can go to the record and find petitions where people are suing their masters for their freedom, for breach of a contract. A quick story involves, can't remember precisely which Harding it was, but he freed the folks he had enslaved and he sent them to Indiana. He gets sick to the point of death, and they come back to visit him, right, to see about him because they cared about him. But alas, he had died before they could get back to him. And then his son tried to re-enslave him, slave them. So this case goes to court. And had it not been for one of his friends who was aware of the transaction or the deal that had occurred, they would have been re-enslaved, but fortunately they were sent back. I cite this as an example to demonstrate that when we think of civil rights, think of it as a long struggle. There was a streetcar boycott in this city at the early part of the 20th century. And of course, the student-led protests that began as early as the 1930s and continue to this day. When we turn our TVs today, I humbly submit to you, we're seeing the continuation of protests. So our young folks here have been fighting for a long time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, there were two things too that I've noticed about what you talked about genealogy. There's a little house in Franklin where a white lady is trying to help the African Americans in Franklin to find their genealogy. And I was so impressed. She had all these students sitting at computers and looking up their history. And there was a story recently about Knoxville, about the fingerprints in the bricks of the buildings.
They have that down in Franklin too. If you go to the Masonic Lodge, on the right side of the building, you can see the small fingerprints.
Good.
Dr. Williams,
Yes.
you mentioned that you and your students visit museums and kind of critique them. Do you have any that you would recommend that are doing a good job?
In my mind, if they are actively trying to better themselves, then that's a good job. Because I don't know, these museums are spaces that struggle with their field being shaped, with their field being formed by primarily white men. So anytime you try to interject something within that space that runs against the grain, it's going to be a struggle. And you know, sometimes, and I've had this conversation a lot, even in my own work. You know, we didn't become historians or get involved in the museum field because we wanted to come to work and fight every day. You know, I love history, so I just want to study and do my thing and have a good time and add to the body of knowledge and make the world a better place. But oftentimes